Hey there, what's going on? It's Chris Carino. This is the Voice of the Nets podcast, coming to you right from the heart of the summer. If you're listening to this on the day that it comes out, you're probably hot. It's hot everywhere right now, all over the world. And we've just gotten through, speaking of hot, in Vegas, Summer League action just wrapped up, and Cam Thomas lit it up again. He was on fire. There's no surprise there. And we're going to talk about it with a very special guest here today. His name's Jonathan Tjarks, Tjarks, Tjarks. Jonathan is a guy who he's part of the Ringer and their podcast network, their NBA show. He does something called Upside High. So his specialty is young NBA developing players, following the guys when they're in college and working their way up. So he's a great guy to talk to. He was in Vegas. He was courtside for a lot of those games. And he is a terrific guy to talk to on a number of NBA things with those young players. We'll talk about some of the bigger names. We'll talk about what he thought of the Nets young players at Summer League. And as I mentioned when we started this podcast, I have a worldview that's a bit unique, having something like muscular dystrophy, what I go through. And I wanted to make sure I included some human interest stories here, some things that I was curious about and stories I wanted to help tell. And Jonathan Tjarks, in addition to being a great NBA guy, has a human interest story as well, because he was diagnosed with a very rare form of cancer a couple of years ago. He revealed it in a story he wrote for The Ringer. I would recommend anyone Google this, The Long Night of the Soul by Jonathan Tjarks. And then another one was, Does My Son Know You? And we'll talk about each one of those articles. And the guy who works on this podcast with us, our sound guy, our engineer, the guy who makes us all sound good and cracks the whip to make sure that all our guests sound good, is Isaac Lee joining us right now. And Isaac was part of the Ringer podcast network. And I know you knew Jonathan or know Jonathan very well. We just finished. We're recording this as an intro to the conversation that we just had. Jonathan is a special guy, and it was a very poignant conversation that we just had. And I was curious to get your reaction from it and what you think, as a way of teasing this for the folks, what you might think of telling everybody.
Yeah, I've known John about 5 years, going back to when I worked at The Ringer. He's always a very honest guy. He doesn't pull punches. He's very candid, very, I would say, like, when it comes to the human interest story, as you were talking about his own deal with his own struggles with getting an early cancer diagnosis, right? He's 34 years old. And he and I have had private conversations about it, and he's spoken very publicly about it. And he and I actually, we have the same religious upbringing, and we talk a lot about that. And he gets into it, and he doesn't. I think you'd be surprised at how frank he is, and how blunt he is, and it's just kind of like a fact of life. And I look at that as kind of inspirational, just the way that he can talk about it and be willing to be open with it, not just to his friends, not just to his family, but to the world, and just say, hey, this is what I'm going through. This is what I'm dealing with. This is what my family has to go through. This is what my family has to deal with. I personally have been inspired by his story, and also personally been very entertained by his basketball opinions and his takes, across the years. And I feel like, look, if you don't know his story, then you're going to learn something new today. If you already know his story, then you're going to get some deeper insight today.
Yeah, and it's funny because when people are facing things, and it's like, you ever see the movie Bridge of Spies?
Yeah.
Great film, right? And Mark Rylance, who was nominated and won an Academy Award for it, he played the Russian spy who was on trial in the United States, and Tom Hanks is his lawyer. And he used to be so cool-headed. Mark Rylance just sat there stoic, and he's about to get sentenced as being found a spy. And Tom Hanks turns to him and said, aren't you worried? And he turned and he looked and he earnestly said, would it help? And I find that when you face things and people are going to go through things in life, it's like, well, if you spend your time worrying and just consumed by the fear, you're never going to be able to truly live in the time that you have left. And I think that's something that I take away from our conversation with Jonathan, I hope people will enjoy it. The basketball stuff and the life stuff. And Isaac, I appreciate you coming on and giving us a few moments. And now you can go back to doing you're working on this or your Ted Lasso podcast, whatever you may. Speaking of feel good things.
Yeah, speaking of feel good things.
Check out your Ted Lasso podcast. Give a plug for your Ted Lasso
sure.
podcast.
Yeah, I have my own podcast. It's called The Icebox. It's my own little sandbox where I kind of explore a bunch of ideas, but I started it with a series called The Book of Lasso, where, again, mentioning my religious background, I'm studying Ted Lasso and rewatching it as though it is a sacred text of sorts. And it's just like a good excuse, honestly.
I think you could take that away. Yeah, I think you can get that takeaway from it.
Yeah. It's also just a good excuse to talk to some friends and be like, hey, listen, you like Ted Lasso? I like Ted Lasso. Let's talk about Ted Lasso.
I already told you, I raised my hand. I won in on season 2, She's a Rainbow episode.
Yeah,
which I love. That's like my favorite episode. All right, Isaac, I appreciate that, man. Thanks for making this podcast always sound so great. That's Isaac Lee, my engineer. So here it is. It's Jonathan Tjarks wrapping up Summer League and having a poignant conversation about his life's journey. It's Jonathan Tjarks on The Voice of the Nets. Jonathan, I know Dallas, what is it up to? About 115 today? What do we got in Dallas?
We've been sitting at about 108 all week, and then it'll pop into the 110s.
Wow. So you went to Vegas. It was pretty much a seamless transition back home to Dallas.
I just said we're going from one sauna. We walked outside, go to the next sauna.
And you were in Vegas for Summer League, and you host the Upside High and part of the Ringer NBA podcast network and all the shows they do. And sort of your milieu is young players developing NBA talent. So let's do the Nesty plunge, all right? Let's cool off. Go right into Vegas and Summer League here. I would imagine it's like your Super Bowl, considering what you kind of focus on with the Ringer going out to Summer League.
Yeah, I love it. I'm a nut like that. I legitimately, I would just do this for a vacation. Like, there's nothing I'd rather do. My wife came out with me, so I'm just watching games all day. Cool. Then we go out to dinner afterwards. And I'm like, for me, this is like my ideal vacation. And some of my colleagues think I'm a nut, but the few diehards, they get it. We touched on it in the introduction about your personal story, and I think we're gonna wrap around to that in a little while. And I think it has something to do with what you just said about how you enjoy spending your time, and you love watching NBA and you love watching these young guys. What stood out? Let's jump right in. What stood out to you the most? What were your biggest takeaways from this year's Summer League, which featured as many good young players as I can remember in a while? Oh, are we talking Nets takeaways or just?
We're talking any takeaways, okay. Anything, and then we'll revert back and get into the Nets a little bit.
I mean, because obviously Cam Thomas was the biggest story. I mean, Summer League, all Summer League.
You want to kiss up to the Net fans right now. We'll get into Cam. And Dayron Sharp is a guy that I want to talk about a little bit. But in general, though, because there's a lot of I feel like we're at a golden age of really good young talent in their first couple of years. Last year's draft was tremendous. I think this year's draft is going to be much the same. And you got to see a lot of those guys in Vegas.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. That was kind of the main thing we were talking about, was all of a sudden there's a whole wave of really good young cores coming up, because last year's draft was really strong. Top of this year's draft was really strong. I mean, the big standouts, it was definitely Paolo and Chet. I would say Paolo more because I had never seen him in person. And this is something sometimes it doesn't always come across on TV. Like with Paolo, just how big he is. You don't really,
because he's so smooth. And someone was even telling me there was this theory because he's like very proportional. You just kind of, your brain doesn't quite process when you're watching him on TV. Oh, this guy's 6. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all right.
This guy's 6'10", 250.
Yeah.
You see it in person, you're like, holy cow. He's bigger than the centers, and he's moving so fast and he's so skilled. That was for sure the biggest takeaway, was just seeing his pure size.
Yeah, as opposed to a guy like Chet Holmgren, who is so lanky and skinny. He looks like he's about 7'8", even though he is over 7 feet tall, but he just looks so much taller.
Yeah, his length. He's kind of, like you were saying, it's kind of the opposite. But what really stands out in these settings are like the very rare physical tools, because you're watching the whole league, like literally every team over a couple of days. So you're seeing the entire rookie class. And in a way, you're really seeing the best young 22-year-old basketball players in the world all assembled in one place. Yeah. And you're looking at this age group. Oh, wow. Look at this one guy, Chet. His arms are so long. There was a couple of times where I saw him, he'd get the ball off the backboard like he was playing volleyball. And it's just like, it's very unusual. So I would say for sure, Chet and Paolo. Unfortunately, I only watched Jaden Ivey for about 5 minutes and he got injured. So that was really disappointing. But I heard he was really remarkable as well when he was healthy.
And, the Nets had a guy, Jabari Smith, years ago. And now his son is Jabari Smith Jr. Jabari Smith Sr. was a real character. I mean, a big, skilled guy, but never had much of an NBA career. I always thought he'd make a good globetrotter because he had this huge personality and he had these skills, So I was shocked when all of a sudden I saw that his son was coming up at Auburn, and he seemed to be like Jabari Smith Jr. seemed to be the safe guy, the guy that can't miss. He's 6'10", he can shoot the three. I know he didn't shoot it well in Vegas, but from the eye test, what do you see out of a guy like Jabari Smith?
Okay, I gotta ask though. I was pretty young for Jabari Smith Sr. What was his game? Who did he play like? I don't really remember him as a player.
Meadowlark Lemon, if you want, like I said about the Globetrotter, he was because he had this I tell the story about he was just a really good personality, very good soul kind of guy, funny, laughing all the time. Maybe not as tall as his son, but he played center and could handle it. And could shoot it, but thought he could do more than he could. He was one of those guys. It's like he thought he can play like Kevin Durant, but he was more. He wasn't as skilled. So his son is a little more ferocious and skilled and a little bigger. But yeah, I think he was on a net team that was kind of like they weren't down all the way yet. It was still Jason Kidd and. But he was a backup, and it wasn't. I thought he was a pretty good player, but he was very raw and unrefined. But again, I thought he could have been a great, in the high post with the bucket of confetti, or looking for taking Washington Generals off the dribble.
Well, every big man has that dream when they're younger of have been the perimeter player, and I thought it was really interesting with Jabari Smith Sr. and then Dave Holmgren, Chet's father, who played college basketball in the 80s. And you kind of got the sense they were like, our games, we were kind of put in this box when we were coming up. The game was different. We're not going to let our sons, we see where the game is going. We're going to make sure our sons have these perimeter skills and are put in situations where they can use them. Like we're not, it's kind of like and it's kind of one of the big storylines of this draft too, is how many players, I mean, you see it in the NBA too, is this is really becoming a family business. It's all generational. Paolo's parents are both D1 athletes. Paolo's mother was one of the great women's players. Jaden Ivey, NFL receiver for a father. Obviously his mom is on ESPN all the time.
Notre Dame.
I mean, that's just kind of how it goes now. These guys are so big and fast, and it makes sense. And their parents, they know the game. They know what needs to happen. And they're making sure their sons are ready. As far as Jabari Jr. goes, I always put him in a different bucket than Paolo and Chet in terms of, I always thought of him more as a complementary player. And I think that's why he wasn't as effective in Summer League, is because he needs guys to set him up. He's more of a pure shooter, come off screens, catch and shoot, one dribble. And so he's having to develop the off the dribble game, the playmaking game. And if you don't have those skills in Summer League, then you're really not gonna shine, because obviously everyone in the Summer League is trying to get their own buckets. It's a dog-eat-dog world, which is why our guy in the Nets was so perfect for Summer League. That's the perfect setting for Kill a Cam.
And the perfect segue. Let's jump into the Nets since we're there. Cam Thomas now 2 years in a row has had great summer leagues. And I thought last year was a harbinger of what was to come. I mean, we saw him make clutch buckets, game-winning shots in summer league. Got a chance to play last year with the Nets with the injuries and guys in and out of the lineup. And he made a couple of game winners. I mean, he iced a game at the Garden last year where he walks it up the floor, trying to make it a 2-possession game, pulls up from 28 feet, drains it. They clinched the game. It was a big comeback. And it was like, wow, we saw all that stuff in Vegas. And now we saw a lot more of it. And what I thought was really interesting was the last game the Nets played against the Celtics Summer League squad is I think he went out there with that mindset of, I'm going to show everybody that I can make plays here. And I don't even know how many shots he took in the first half, but he had a bunch of assists, and he was almost like showing like, hey, I can do other things besides score. But we know the guy is a bucket getter.
Yeah, Cam was one of my favorite players to scout. I guess it was 2 years ago now.
At LSU.
Because he knew what he was, as you said, like Cam, more than most young players, he knows who he is. He knows what his role is. And I believe it was almost a record in terms of field goal attempts to assists when he was at LSU. The ratio.
He knows, as Steve Nash used to say to me all the time, he knows where the basket is.
Yes. And so, I think for him, his rookie year, he's not going to be not going to have any lacking in confidence. Like that's never going to be an issue for him. When he's out there, for better or for worse, he's going to make things happen. And I just think year 2 for him is just, learning the NBA, learning personnel. I think the biggest thing for him and for a lot of the young players in this team, and obviously there's a lot going on right now, but stability of roles is important too. I think that's really hard as a rookie when you're just being thrown in there, when the lineups are always changing and your roles changing. Yeah. It's hard enough to adjust to the NBA. But then if 1 week you're the 8th man, the next week you're the starting 2 guard, there's very different responsibilities. And I think that was probably a struggle for him. So I think the hope is that he can have a very defined role in year 2 and kind of flourish within that role. So I think that's the key for young players.
Yeah, I think the whole net team struggled with that last year, trying to, get, I think they set a franchise record for the second year in a row with the amount of starting lineups, between COVID and injuries, and things just were a wreck, and guys could never really know what their roles were. I look at Cam, in that, I used to say this about D'Angelo Russell sometimes, I almost saw more of that 6th man, come off the bench, just go get buckets. Like, don't worry about getting other guys involved. Be that Jamal Crawford type player where you just come in and light it up. And I maybe see that role for Cam down the road in the NBA. I don't know. I don't know if he's an everyday rely on him as your starting 2. Could be. I think it comes down probably to the defensive end, right? I think that when you talk about coaches' trust, it usually comes from what you can do on the defensive end. That's why a guy like Kessler Edwards got more of a role with the Nets last year, because I think the coaches trusted him to make the right decisions, not offensively, but defensively. And I think even when you watch Kessler in the summer league, it's like you were pointing out before, guys are just in that element of going out and scoring. Kessler's like a guy that does a little bit of everything, and he's solid. And maybe it didn't jump off the page in the summer league, but it's kind of like the kind of guy that coaches trust.
For sure. There's definitely a difference. It's way more. I remember talking to someone, and he was saying, this is like watching the most high-level pickup in summer league.
Yeah.
And you're just watching these guys go up and down. There's not really stakes. And he was telling me he kind of enjoyed it more because it's just pure basketball. And the game's over, you go on with your day, it's no big deal. But definitely a guy like Kessler is going to do better in a more structured environment. And go back to Cam. Yeah, it's locking in on defense. That's the key to maintain a starting job. I thought of him kind of coming in as somewhere between Buddy Hield and Jordan Clarkson. And then if you look at both those guys, Buddy Hield's been a starter, but he's never really held down a starting job. He's always been in and out because of his defense.
Yeah.
Because either you're the primary option and we're going to cover for you on defense, or you're a secondary and you've got to be locked in on D. So if Cam if Cam can't be locked in on D and he is a little undersized, that means that puts him to primary off the bench 6-man.
Yeah, and he can, and in that role you can flourish. And I another guy that we brought him up before, and talking about the Nets Summer League's squad, is a guy that I'm really excited about what he might be able to bring. Is Dayron Sharp. I mean, I have a friend of mine who's a really good basketball guy, would text me during games last year like, man, Dayron Sharp's going to be the best big on that team. I know nothing against Nick Claxton, but I love Claxton and his energy and everything. Dayron can do a lot. I mean, he can shoot the three we saw in the Summer League. I don't know if necessarily he's going to be a sharpshooting Kyle Korver three shooter, but he's got a real feel and he's got good hands and he's just a natural born rebounder. What would you take away when you see Dayron out there?
Sharp is interesting. I kind of wish he had stayed in school 2 years ago because then he could have had a really big role and flourished within that and not been able to play 30, been a featured player. You look at Walker Kessler, who Sharp was playing with at UNC. He stays as a sophomore. He goes to Auburn. I believe he wins National Defensive Player of the Year. If he didn't win it, he was one of the top 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And he ended up boosting his draft stock a lot. And I think Sharp, like all these young guys, needs to play. And then it's a matter of once you're on the floor, then we can find ways to utilize your skills. But first, you got to get on the floor. And then for Sharp, the challenge is he is very skilled offensively. It's how can we put you in a defensive system that allows you to be out here? And are we going to move our defensive system to maximize you? Because when you're a center, it's defense first. Unless you're Nikola Jokic and you're a center, you're playing defense first. You're like a guy like Cam, we can hide you on the perimeter pretty easily. But if you're a center, it's all about defense. And so my thing with Dayron has always been, how much is he going to move his feet? How much can he protect the rim? And it's hard because it's hard. I don't get to watch him a ton. I mean, obviously his minutes are up and down. So I'm not totally sure where he falls on that. But I think those are the main two things is if he can survive defensively, then he can use the rest of his skill set to help the team on offense.
And being able to guard multiple positions from the center position has become something that's really important. The way these teams defend pick and roll, a guy like Nick Claxton can get out and can keep guards in front of him. You're not getting exposed that way, and then he could still drop back and protect the rim. That seems to be it's people talk about going small at the center position. It's really not so much from a smaller size. It's like a quickness kind of thing. It's a dexterity kind of thing. Can you keep guards in front of you?
I mean, you look at the conference finals this year, right?
Yeah.
So Dallas, Maxi Kleba, Dwight Powell. They even played Dorian Finney-Smith at center. Golden State, Kevon Looney, Draymond Green. Miami, Bam Adebayo, and then Boston, Time Lord Al Horford. These are all smaller centers who can move in space and make quick decisions. And that's the game at the highest level. You're right. It's like small ball itself, just putting a 6'7" guy there doesn't mean necessarily to do anything. But they've got to have a certain skill set that teams are looking for.
Yeah. And even you mentioned Time Lord, Robert Williams. I mean, he's not more than 6'9", but he plays so much bigger and his timing, and he can sit back and play at the rim, play drop, but then he could also, get out and guard guards and guard smaller players.
That's defensive flexibility. That's everything now at center.
Yeah. And two-way guys. I mean, that's just, can you contribute on both ends of the floor? I remember, in that Nets Boston series this year, which was I know it sounds like I'm being homerish, but it was a little closer than a 4-game sweep might necessarily be. Every game really came down to a couple of possessions in the fourth quarter. But the problem was, and I talked about this with Brian Scalabrine on a podcast earlier, it was like the Celtics don't have to make a lot of decisions. They can just put guys on the floor that play both ends. They can shoot the three. I mean, Robert Williams is not a three-point shooter, but you know the guys that can play. And you don't have to make a decision between an offensive guy like Cam Thomas or a defensive-minded player, or a three-point shooter or a defensive-minded player. And that's the way the league is kind of going. 6'7", 6'8", 6'6" guys that can shoot the three and at the same time can defend. And then you don't have to make a lot of decisions from a coaching standpoint.
For sure. I mean, I thought in that series, just the perimeter size When you don't have that perimeter spies, you're always kind of fighting uphill. I remember like Jaylen Brown was getting guarded by like 6'2", 6'3" guys, and that's just it's just not going to work.
Yeah. And you needed those guys to get some offense, and so it's one or the other. You pick your poison. Whereas the Celtics were like, no, here's our team, go out there.
Well, I mean, it's funny, right? Pick your poison, like either way. Right?
Yeah,
the expression kind of says itself.
John, in terms of when you're watching these summer league games, though, and can you really evaluate? Like you said, it's like a big pickup game. Are there any examples of guys that you said, hey, this guy was he didn't really show what he can do in summer league, but ended up being a really good player, or vice versa? This guy was awesome in summer league, but it really didn't translate to the NBA. I would imagine you can get fooled a little bit because of the nature of those summer league games.
For sure. I always say with summer league, it's 2 weeks of confirmation bias. So if you already like a guy and he plays well in summer league, it's like, well, this is great. I mean, look at him play well. But if he plays poorly, you just say, oh, it's just summer league. Like, don't worry about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can process it. You can sell it any way you like. It's true.
I think for me, what I try to use summer league for is just to get eyes and just to see their size and speed. So like, I'm barely even watching the game. I'm just watching individual players, and I'm seeing how are they moving in traffic? How are they making decisions? I'm just trying to lock in on them and just kind of put in my mental index, like, how fast is this guy really? How big is this guy really? My favorite parlor game in summer league, I spent half the time, how tall is he? And like, is he 6'3" or is he 6'4"? And it's like this endless parlor game of guessing heights and weights.
Yeah, that's still, there's still a lot of times you look at guys' listed heights and go, oh, I don't know. I don't know about that one. Speaking of, who's the guy, the French kid that next year is going to be the big prize, Wanyama?
Mm-hmm.
He's out in France. He's probably going to be the number one pick right now, right? I mean, he's looking like the guy that everybody's focused on, and yet I think I saw a picture of him next to Chet Holmgren, and I think he was taller.
He's for sure taller than Chet. That's
crazy.
They played at the U19 championship game last year, which is an amazing game looking back on it. You had Chet versus Victor. US pulled it out in the end. Victor was at least 7'3". If Chet's 7 foot, that's the other thing. It's always a reference point. Okay, if Chet's 7'1", then Victor's got to be at least 7'3". That's what you're doing half the time. It's like, do I know this guy's height? Then I'm gonna try to guess this guy's height.
And really, like Kevin Garnett, all those years, he was definitely 7 foot, but never wanted to be listed at 7 foot because he didn't want to be seen as a center, right? And
I think there are other players on your roster who have that same thought process.
Yes, Kevin Durant, we could say it. Hey, let's make a big right turn here, or left turn, wherever you want to call it here. Jonathan Tjarks, you obviously we're with the Ringer and Upside High and the Ringer Podcast Network and the NBA show for them, and you do an awesome job. People, definitely NBA folks, need to check it out. A couple of years ago, you wrote a piece for the Ringer where you talked about your cancer diagnosis, a Ewing's-like sarcoma that's very rare and can be deadly. And this is something you talked about in an article called "The Long Night of the Soul," and then you followed it up with another article called "Does My Son Know You?" And I'd love to get into both of those things. First, your initial diagnosis. Where are you now? And how are you feeling? And what is your, have you learned more about, since you wrote The Long Night of the Soul, which I hope people will check out, have you learned more about your condition?
Okay, yeah, I guess I'll just say up the top. Yeah, I was diagnosed with the stage 4 Ewing's-like sarcoma last April. Unfortunately, when they put it into, they'll say a disease is either curable or treatable. So mine is only treatable. And what that means is, given the current state of medicine, there's no medical way to cure this disease as far as the doctors know. So all they can do is try to extend my life as long as they can. So it's a terminal diagnosis. That was last year. We don't know a ton more about it. It is very rare because what matters is less like you want to have enough data to make good decisions, like sample size. I'm sure everyone here listening to this pod knows about that. The problem is there's just not a very big sample size. And like, I'm part of the sample size now. So maybe in 5 to 10 years, they'll have a bigger sample size to be able to know more about it. But in terms of an individual case, it's hard to, you only learn, because like an individual case, anything can happen. So you only learn about disease when you have enough people in a cohort. So you can have a sample as representative. So in that sense, we don't know much more about it. It has progressed over time. I'm no longer taking, basically the thought was always my disease is that we want to use conventional medicine as long as we can, and then we'll go into experimental stuff. And hopefully the longer the runway we have, the more time for the experimental stuff to kind of catch up. Well, right now I'm just on the experimental stuff. And so it's all kind of, we're all just playing it week by week, really. And that's the hard part too. It always changes the challenges with it.
And it's hard when it's something that doesn't affect a lot of people because, the general umbrella of cancer, it not necessarily what cures one cancer is going to cure another. And when I experienced this in muscular dystrophy, when less than 1 million people in the world have what I have, there's not a lot of money in it for pharmaceutical companies or, so it's not, there's not a lot of customers per se. So it becomes the kind of thing where it doesn't get the kind of attention it needs from a research standpoint. But I would imagine, hearing that in the story you wrote, The Long Night of the Soul, which was kind of a play on the Dark Night of the Soul, the poem, right? I think which is sort of, it describes an existential crisis and how you kind of change the way you feel about life and how you look at the world. I'm sure this is a complex topic, but how has it changed the way you go about your everyday life?
Oof, man, there's a lot to that. I guess I'll start with, it's just the idea of when you're actually forced to face your own mortality. It's kind of puts you on a spot where it's very easy. So I'm a Christian and it's very easy to kind of slip service to all the different dogmas of Christian theology, which I still believe in. But it's like, okay, do you really believe this? Because now you're actually going to die. And I think, especially in our society, we're so removed from death. Yeah, I mean, I'm 34. Like I never thought about it. Like I'll deal with that when I'm 70, You just don't. It's just natural, I suppose. I think it is anyways. And especially I think in our society where death is so removed. It's in hospitals, it's in nursing homes. We don't see it day to day, really. You just don't. And then people are living longer, they're healthier. And like the death is just pushed further and further away. And you just kind of ignore it. You don't think about it. But then at a certain point in everyone's life, you're just forced to confront, I'm really going to die. Like, and it's one of those things, as I was saying, everyone knows that, but you don't really know it until you're there. And in a way, I feel like I'm lucky in that I was given a timeline. Like, I'm going to die. What am I going to do? How am I going to live my life? What does that mean for my life, for my family? Whereas most people my age, if they're going to pass away, it's usually a sudden thing, right? Where it's just car accident, plane crash.
Yeah.
No. But for me, and I think it's like I would say this last year and a half has just been a very slow process of getting my mind around that fact and trying to just like deal with it. Cause it's the ultimate question I think everyone has to deal with, this, obviously.
And, it's like the kind of thing too, where people think when you're faced with mortality that every day is going to be, well, I've got to go jump out of airplanes and climb a mountain, or get lost on a beach, or but you have the thing that, and anybody going through any kind of chronic disease or anything that's life threatening, it's like your day to day life goes on. You can't live like there's no tomorrow, because that you've got to plan for things, and you've got. So what I guess my question would be to you is it big moments that you seek, or are you just paying closer attention to to the little things, the time with your son, the time with your wife, the time doing this, talking hoops, going to Vegas, going back to what you said earlier about, this is what I love to do, going to Vegas and watching hoops. Like, it doesn't have to be climbing Mount Kilimanjaro to live. It could be, well, no, I found something that I really love to do. And if I only have a finite time left, this is the stuff that I want to do.
Yeah, it's funny because you're right. There's like this popular image of the bucket list. Oh, you got 6 months to live. Oh, I got to go to my bucket list. But number one, if someone tells you you have 6 months to live, climbing Mount Kilimanjaro is probably out. Your body probably can't handle doing something like that.
Yeah, you're probably right. You're probably right.
That was the most frustrating thing for me at first.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Is because, I'm thinking I want to do all this stuff. Like, I don't know how much time I have left, but I'm having to accept my physical limitations. And that was a really, really hard part of the process for me. It was like, okay, no, I can't. And I didn't want to do it. Like, I wanted to still be able to wake up when I used to wake up. I wanted to still be able, I would plan out my day. Well, I'm going to do these 6 things. Like, no, I can't do that anymore. I can only do 3 of those things. And I think and you're right, it's like time. Like, what is really important to me? And it is the small things. It's the small things with your family. And it's like, what do I really love and enjoy? And how can I best use that time? And a lot of times too, you end up like beating yourself up. You're like, did I have to be on Twitter right there? Like, I only have 6 months. That Twitter time was not very useful.
No. It seems like a waste of time, right? But you got, but you're doing what you love, right? I mean, you're doing the things that, being part of the Ringer and the NBA show. And I mean, this is what you had worked your whole life for, right?
For sure. And that's why, I took some time off from work a couple of times, but then I just kept coming back because I said, this is what I love to do. I remember, so I took some time off work right around March Madness. And then I find myself calling my partner on the podcast to talk about what happened. It's like, I'm already doing this anyways. I still want to watch this. There's no reason to not just do it. Yeah. And in that sense, I feel very blessed. I feel very, very blessed that I have the kind of job that I would still want to do. And I think I try not to take that for granted.
I think there's a term like dharma in sort of where they say, like, if you won the lottery, would you still do what you're doing? And my wife always joked with me, like, if we ever hit the lottery, you probably would still keep your job. I'm like, yeah, well, I'd still want to go call NBA games. Like, I don't know why I would want to. Are you going to punish me if I win the lottery? I'm not allowed to do that anymore. Like, that's something. So, and I think facing your mortality is also like that. Gives you this. All right, you really look at it and say, what is it that I want to? How do I want to spend my time? And that's what, and I guess that's what you're doing right now. But there's a practical day-to-day nature about what you're going through that the days do go on.
For sure. And there was definitely moments where I'm like, oh, I have to spend all this time so wisely. I have to spend this meaningful time with my son every day. He's 1.5 years old. There's only so much we can do in this time. And I still have I have time for other things. My wife still has to work, right? Yeah. So it's like, there's time for me to do other things. It's like sometimes you get so caught up in like what's quote unquote meaningful. But it's like, what's meaningful is doing things you enjoy, blessing other people, hang out with your friends, your coworkers. That's very meaningful. I think that's probably the biggest thing. Okay, so now I'm getting to the feel of this. So I think one thing that happened for me, okay, when you know that, okay, time is running short on Earth, the first thing I remember thinking this a lot lately, it's like, it goes by so fast. You don't think of it in the moment, but it goes by so fast. And I think back, I'm like, man, I think back to my childhood, school, getting out of college, working, meeting my wife, having a family. And I look back now, I'm like, that all went by so fast. They always say at the NFL, they say it's not for long. Life is that way too. And I think, and even though I'm so young, I think even if you're older, you have the same feeling because the older you get, the faster it goes, right? Time just starts to speed up. And so you're like, if I'm only here for this amount of time, like what's really meaningful? And then it's just like, I think of it sometimes like this. I'm like, I'm 34. 34 years from now, what's going to be meaningful? It's like, it's going to be the relationships I had. Those are going to be the people who still remember me as my wife and my son, my friends. And it's like, how can I invest in those people with the time I have? Because that's what's really meaningful. Everything else just kind of goes, like you think about it like, so I was born in 1987. And you think about how many people who died in 1987 do you even remember in 2022? Very few, right? Like it's just not how it goes. Like the world goes on, time goes on, life goes on. But it's like those people who died then, who remembers them as their kids, their family, their friends, how they impacted those people in their lives. That's where you're still remembered.
You wrote an article for The Ringer called "Does My Son Know You?" And I think that what you're talking about now is what you kind of cover there is that the thing that you had learned. Your father had passed away when you were young, and he had Parkinson's when you were around 6, and he passed away when you were 12. And you said that you saw people come to the memorial, the funeral, and you didn't really know them very well. And now your time is with your son. You mentioned being so young, and you don't know how much time you have with him left, but you want to invest in the people and your relationships that can be in his life, so that the people that knew you and that loved you will be around for him. And I thought that was an incredibly poignant piece that you wrote that could have talked about what you're talking about now. And I thought that line about investing in other people so they can be there for him was really impactful.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And in case my dad, he got it, the illness turned when I was 12. He passed away when I was 21. So just in case. So
okay.
But anyway, so yeah, like the point of that, and especially with my dad, because he was sick for so long. And I think one thing I learned growing up is that my dad had a lot of friends when he was healthy. And it happened very, very slowly that as he got sicker, we started seeing them less. And then as I kind of talked about, and then when you're at the funeral, it's like, what do you need? It's like, I have not talked to you in 10 years. Like, at this point, don't need much from you. I don't know you. And I think, and I was kind of getting into the piece too, I think, is the way our society is set up. It's very hard to find community, to be part of something bigger than yourself. I think we all have that in school and to a lesser extent work, but that's so tied into, well, you're only in school for so long, and work, you never know, right? Anything can happen with that. Yeah. And you lose those touch points. It's just easy to fall off. There's no way to there's no like real intuitive way to stay connected. And I think that was so important for me and my wife. That's why we're very involved in church. It's like, okay, these are people, like we see them every week. My son sees them every week. My son sees their kids every week. And it's like, my thought is right now, I've got to plug in as much as I can. I've got to my son's got to know these people now so that they can be there for him as he gets older. And I think that's kind of the great tragedy of our way of life, I think, as Americans, is that most people, I call it in the piece relational insurance, is that we don't have that. And it's like, for me, and I was kind of talking about how like most people my age who pass away, it's because of something sudden, right? And that's the reality, is none of us knows when our time's going to end. And when you get diagnosed like this, and they say, okay, is your insurance set up? Like, what's your medical insurance? What's your life insurance? Is your estate? Like, let's get a lawyer. And all that stuff's important financially, obviously. But it's like, you've got to make sure you have insurance for your family in case you aren't there relationally. And I think that's the one thing people don't have, right? I saw some article where it was like 1 in 4 Americans don't have a close friend. And it's like, you can get by, and it's not the best way to live, but you can get by. Your family can get by without close friends. But if something happens to you and it's just your wife and your kid, you're not going to make it without people around you, around them.
There's when you get an illness or some kind of condition. I know I've experienced this too. You get a little bit of isolation, because whether or not you don't feel well and you can't socialize like you once did, or if you're in a wheelchair, people don't think about, I can't go over people's houses because I can't get in the house. It becomes isolating at times. You avoid things because of your illness. But it's important. And I think if people listen to this and they know someone who's going through things like this, And a lot of times people are hesitant to ask for help or to be involved. And it's like, no, like you reach out to those people and become part of their lives and see what they need and talk to those people and try not to, again, invest in that relationship. It goes both ways. Don't be afraid of it. Did you ever see the show Council of Dads?
No, I'm not. There was that one.
There was a show a few years ago on NBC. It only lasted 1 year. It didn't renew it for a second year, but I'd actually watched it. I think I got hooked on it because of the commercials were like during This Is Us or something, and I was watching that. And it was a very similar story to your own, where it was a man it was based on a novel, I think, and he was in the restaurant business, and he was diagnosed with cancer. He knew it was terminal, and he assembled this council of dads. There were 3 other friends of his that he sort of said they had made them make a promise to fulfill certain things that a dad would do when his time was up. And he wanted that when I pass on, I want you guys to be around. And the show picks up after the father has already passed, and there's these 3 guys, and they're just always around. They're there. They had a bunch of kids, and they're just always there to take them to Little League games and teach them how to ride a bike. And it was very similar to what you talk about in terms of while you're alive, investing in people who will then be there because they want to be. Like I've always said, even when I went through what I was going through, I've gotten a lot of help, and a lot of people are there in my life. And when I started a foundation, so many people came forward and want to help. And I like to think it's because of the way I treated people before I was, had this condition. And when I need help, it's there. And I think you probably, when you're facing mortality, you think more about that, I guess is what we're saying.
Well, first off, this is amazing. I had never heard of this show. I was like, I got to watch this. This is unbelievable.
It's like, your story, right?
Golly. Wow. And there's a book too. I got to read this book. He has bone cancer. Oh my God. I got to talk to this guy. Jeez Louise.
Yeah. It's a place in Savannah, Georgia, I think, is where they based the show.
Yeah. Rare bone cancer, which he made a full recovery. My goodness. Okay. I'm going to have to watch this show. So it's a good show, like on its own. Is it a comedy or is it kind of in between?
No, like a drama, but feel good by the end.
So kind of like Parenthood, that kind of show?
A little bit, yeah. A little. I think they were going for the This Is Us vibe, if you've ever heard of that show.
I've seen This Is Us, but that show is a little too intense for me.
Yeah.
There's always pushing the pedal.
You got your own stuff going on. You don't need to have so much human emotion right on TV.
Yeah, and I think kind of what you were saying, and I believe this is, as a Christian, Jesus said, like, what you do for the least of us, you did for me. And it's so different for me now, because when I was healthy, I never felt like the least of us, I always looked at it like, I got to help because I have the ability. And that's true, but it's like, it hits so much deeper when you're the one who needs help, when you're the one who can't do it on your own. Yeah, and it's those small acts of kindness that are just so meaningful. Yeah, and what you were saying is like people, a lot of times, I don't want to impose. They'll say that, like, I don't want to impose on this. I want to give him his space.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, I'd rather hear from people. Like, if I know you, I want to hear from you. And it's like, I want to, don't have that attitude where I don't want to impose is like the worst thought you can have. Like, if you're trust me, there's not been anyone who has like pushed too hard with me. Right? But like, God, I don't want to hear from this person anymore. I don't want to be cared for or loved. That doesn't exist.
I even thought about when we asked you to come on the podcast. I'm like, you be like, well, I don't want to take the guy's time. No, this is like living for you, right? Talking hoops and being a broadcaster and being in the media. I know you did it. It was a hard, you had to fight through. You were at Dallas, the Mavericks for a while. You got where you wanted to be. So this is it. This is living, right? I mean, not necessarily maybe sitting on a Zoom with me is living, but it's living.
Well, don't sell yourself short. Voice of the Nets. I mean, how big is that?
Yeah. Well, were you part of the? So you did your time with the Dallas Mavericks media. And it's probably why I know we probably crossed paths at some point along that line. So that meant you probably got to do the Mark Cuban treadmill press conference.
Yes, I have certainly done the Mark Cuban treadmill press conference, no question. It's a very unique experience. I don't think there's any other He's the only person I've ever interviewed working out, and that creates its own dynamic. I always joke that when I was on the beat, it was like the years where they had Monte Ellis and Harrison Barnes and Chandler Parsons. Then I got hired by the Ringer, go national, and Luka comes. I was at every game of the Harrison Barnes era. I wasn't married, I didn't have any kids. Then Luka comes, I'm like barely making to like once a month. It's just like, what are the timing of these things?
Timing, everything's about timing. Speaking of timing, I know I got to let you run here, Jonathan. I really appreciate you being so candid and talking about that. I feel like that I've always said I've had this conversation with other people that go through difficult times, and it's like, we wish we could have learned all this stuff in a book without going through it. Because you do learn things, and it does give you a perspective that others don't get. But hopefully people that aren't going through it, and maybe I hope to God, people never have to go through stuff. But listening to conversations like this is kind of like learning it a little bit from a podcast or a book rather than having to go through it. But I really thank you for your candor and your insight on the Summer League. And I really had a great time talking to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. And yeah, and that for me is like the ability to talk about this stuff is like one of the redeeming parts of it, which I'm always trying to find redeeming parts of it because it can be very hard sometimes to find them. But it's like, this is one of the big ones. And so I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, well, we'll do it again sometime. Thanks, Jonathan.
For sure.
All right, appreciate it, man. Thank you. All right, my thanks to Jonathan Tjarks. I hope you enjoyed that conversation and got a lot out of it, both from a basketball perspective and from a life perspective. Really enjoyed talking to him. Hope you enjoyed listening to it. I want to thank Tom Dowd, our producer, Isaac Lee, our engineer. We continue with our summer shows. We've got some really good stuff coming up. Players, former players, coaches, things like that. So keep it right here. Subscribe. Please give us a good rating if you enjoy it. That always goes a long way. Thanks so much. I'm Chris Carino. This is the Voice of the Nets.